So to recap a little bit, at the end of Genesis last week, Joseph and his brothers and their families, sort of the whole tribe of Jacob is in Egypt. And you remember that Joseph had risen to a position of power in the Egyptian government. In fact, he was like the number 2 guy under Pharaoh. So life was pretty good for the sons and other descendants of Jacob in Egypt. But that didn't last very long. They're not living very long in that land when the Pharaoh that knew Joseph and respected him and remembered all the good things that he had done to help Egypt survive is gone. And there's a new king. And that new king doesn't remember Joseph. And all he sees are people in his country, in his land, who are not Egyptians, who are potential subversives. Pharaoh saw the Israelite people as a threat. And he says, well, if there's a war, if we get attacked, they might side with our enemies. They're not like us. We can't trust them. We don't know what will happen. So the Pharaoh has a solution to this problem, a solution that was common in the ancient world. You have a vulnerable population, people that are refugees or victims of war or natural disaster, enslaved. So Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, and they're living this life of slavery and oppression, and things look really, really bad. As the book of Exodus begins, Abraham's descendants have become slaves. And they've grown in numbers so that the Egyptians are really nervous about them. And so things go from bad to worse, right? Pharaoh has an idea to keep the Israelites under control, a slow genocide. So he says to the midwives, look, here's how it's going to be. You go in, if it's a boy baby, you kill him. If it's a girl baby, you let her live. Because that works really well for the oppressor, right? That works really well for the empire. Because that way, there's no young men, right? There's no threat. And you keep the young women as slaves. So that the empire is looking, Pharaoh thinks he has it covered. Things are going to be really, really good. But he didn't count on God stepping in, right? Because whenever there's a big problem in the world, God prepares people to act as God's partners, as God's agents to solve the problem. In other words, God gets involved by challenging us to get involved. And you know how this works, right? So who does God prepare to solve this problem? Who does God prepare to solve this problem of Israelites being slaves in Egypt? Moses. Absolutely 100% incorrect. Right? Because there is no Moses without Shiphrah and Puah, the 2 bravest people in history that you never heard of. Right? Think about it. Think about it. These 2 midwives who are at the bottom of the social structure, right? They're female slaves in the Egyptian empire. And the Pharaoh, who is considered a god, right? He's not just the king, he's a god in this society. He tells them, here's what you're going to do. You're going to kill all the baby boys so that there are no threats to my power. And Shiphrah and Puah say, you know what? No, we're not afraid of you. We're not going to do it. We're going to do the right thing. And because Shiphrah and Puah do the right thing, all those little boys, including Moses, and it goes on from there, right? It's not just Shiphrah and Puah, because as Caitlin pointed out, who is it that gets Moses, little baby Moses, because he's still under threat, right? He's still under threat. Pharaoh is still in power, and although his plan to have the midwives be his agents of death has not worked out, he's still in control. So there's still a threat to these little boys. So Moses' 10-year-old sister is entrusted with the task of spiriting him down to the river, right? Another brave young man. And so he gets down the river, and then, of course, he gets found by Pharaoh's daughter. So here's Pharaoh's daughter, a member of the royal household, somebody who has absolutely no reason to care at all about worthless little Hebrew slaves. And she goes down to the river, and she picks up this baby and takes that baby into her house. She has compassion. Somehow God moved her heart to have compassion and bring that baby into her home. So, yes, it is Moses that eventually God uses to deliver the Israelites. But there is no Moses without Shiphrah and Puah. There is no Moses without brave young Miriam. There is no Moses without that nameless daughter of Pharaoh who decides to cut across the cultural lines and save a Hebrew baby. Because this is the way that God works in the world, to draw us into the place of freedom and life. That God is amazingly, you know what this story says is that God is amazingly not on the side of the powerful. God is not on the side of the status quo. God is not on the side of Pharaoh, who was a god. But God is on the side of the slaves. What an unbelievable idea at the time that this happened. That God was on the side of slaves. That God was on the side of the most vulnerable people. And really, that God would use, that God would invite into partnership with him some people who were at the bottom of the social ladder. Right? That those would be the people that God would use to bring freedom and life to his people. It's an incredible story. And it's a core story. It's a key story for who we are as followers of God, as followers of Jesus. Because it's a story that's actually continued by Jesus, right? That Jesus was a Jew. And Jesus, as he grew up, would celebrate that Passover meal that would remember the deliverance of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. He would celebrate that. He would share that with his friends. He knew that story. He lived that story. And in the context that he lived in, there was another oppressor, right? The Israelites, the Israelite people then, the Jews then, lived under the oppression of another empire, of Rome. And see, here's where Jesus kind of turns things in a different way, right? Because everybody kind of expected, the way that freedom works is you get together a whole bunch of people and you lead them to political freedom. And the way that everybody expected it to work is the Jews would get together and God would be on their side like God was of old, and God would fight for them, and they would battle the Romans and defeat the Romans, and they would be a free people again. They would have their kingdom, their political kingdom restored. But Jesus says, no, there is a deeper freedom. That's important. Political freedom is important, but Jesus was saying there's something more, there's something deeper that I have to offer. That freedom of being free to be God's people no matter what the circumstances. That possibility of being free from the forces that oppress you, from not just the political forces, but from the forces of sin, of alienation from God, that drive you into a place of hopelessness. That Jesus came to show us that freedom and to pull us into that place of true life. And this story from the Gospels here shows us one place where that breaks in, right? That God is always on the side of the vulnerable and pulling people who are vulnerable into places of empowerment and freedom. There's this story where Jesus runs into this woman whom some of the Pharisees have gotten. They say, look, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. Important words. In the very act of adultery. So is there any question that there was somebody else involved? Is there any question who the other person involved was? So the natural question then is, where is he? Right? Maybe it was one of the Pharisees, and they said, we don't want our buddy to look bad, much less get killed. But whatever the cause is, he's not there, but the woman's there. And Jesus looks at these guys, and they say, well, you know what the law says? The law says, big rocks. That's what the law says. What do you say, Jesus? And Jesus just stoops down and writes on the ground. And nobody really knows what he's writing, but one guess is that he starts writing down the 10 Commandments. Right? You shall not kill. You shall not murder. You shall not covet. You know, he looks up at these guys and says, okay, whoever among you has no sin, go ahead. Throw the first stone. And those guys, they look. They say, no sin, huh? Well, not me. And beginning with the oldest, they all melt away. They all vanish. And what Jesus says to the woman is, there's nobody here to condemn you, then I don't condemn you either. Go and be free. Go and be free. Go and be free from your life of sin. Be released from anything that was oppressing you. But see, I think it's complicated. It's complicated what was going on there. And so Jesus recognizes that this is a complicated situation. And he says to her, go. Go and have a new life. Start over, because you're free. There's nobody here to condemn you, and God doesn't condemn you either. That's freedom. So God invites us to be like that, to show and demonstrate in our lives, to side with the vulnerable, and to speak words of hope and freedom. We're all called to be partners with God in that way. The same way that Moses was. And if Moses is a little bit too big for you, well, you can always be Shipra, or Pua, or Miriam, because those people partnered with God too, to change the world. God offers the same invitation to us, and invites us into that place of hope and freedom. Thanks be to God.